Hi there. Thanks for coming. We'll make a start, so we're running on time. I think there might be one or two still to come in, but we'll let them in quietly if that happens. So, welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Alex Gillett. I work here at the University of York, and I'll be chairing the event today. And it's a great day, and days like this, you know, I'm chairing a couple of these talks around business of sport on a nice campus and a beautiful day. I feel like I've got the best job in the world sometimes. Today's one of those days, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you in person here today as well. Hopefully enjoy it just as much as I'm going to. I was supposed to be co-chairing this with my author and colleague here at York, Dr. Kevin Tennant. Unfortunately, he's ill and he cannot join us today, but we do wish him well, and he's definitely input in proposing the event, helping, you know, putting questions together with me and all that. So he's here in spirit, even if his health's keeping him away from being here in person. On to this morning's event. We're delighted to welcome Alex Jackson, Dr. Alex Jackson, curator at the National Football Museum in Manchester. Alex has worked with Kevin and I using material. We did an ESRC Impact Accelerator funded project around the 1966 FIFA World Cup, and that fed into some exhibitions that they did at the National Football Museum, which is where I came into contact with Alex and got on very well and realised he was doing some great research, some of which we cited in our own book and things, and he's just been a great contact and colleague, friend ever since. He's been publishing himself, and he's going to talk about some of that today, of what he's been doing. His research has explored football during wartime and the evolution of women's football. And this morning, he's going to share with us his research from his latest book, Football's Great War, Association Football on the English Home Front, 1914 to 1918. Is that right still?
Yes, and also with a comparison with the COVID pandemic. I'm trying to pick out some similarities between the two areas.
Exactly. That's the bit I wanted to make sure I got that bit right. So you're drawing on the COVID, the corresponding things with that as well. It's going to look at how a global crisis challenged and changed the people's game, okay? And we've got some questions as we'll go along. And then what we'll do when Alex has shown you his slides, and I've asked him, we've had a bit of conversation around that. We'll open it up for questions as well from the audience after that. Okay, so I'll take a seat and we can begin, and Alex can take over with his clicker. Just to confuse things, we're both called Alex. So I won't say I don't think we'll call each other by name, but
call me AJ. That's what my teammates in football.
AJ, Jacko, something like that.
Something like that.
In a few words, what's the main point of your book, really? And you know, what would you like to discuss today in the context of the COVID pandemic in particular?
Cheers. Well, I've been working at the museum since about 2011 it was, and in 2014 we did our centenary exhibition on football in the First World War. And when I did that, there was a lot of coverage to do with football at the front. Some of you may have heard the stories of the Christmas truce played in 1914 between British and German soldiers. Probably heard of the rise of women's football. And one of the things we found in the exhibition was relatively little written about the home front story. It's often seen as a period when football stopped, and wars in general are seen as unimportant bits between peacetime in terms of sports development generally. So I, being me, I decided to use a bit of my spare time over the next 8 years after that to sort of research that topic. And then just as I was coming to finish the book, obviously COVID came along. And that was quite interesting because I could see both echoes in football's response in the research that I've been doing, how the game responded, and also amongst how people are trying to understand football in a time of COVID, of what happens, how should sports react to something like that. So the kind of big sort of takeaway sort of idea of why I found it was important, thought it was quite, the big idea, so to speak, was obviously today's modern football is, the big issue in it is money. Where does money come from? What impact does it have on the game, especially at the professional elite level? And this is a big question at the start of the First World War. In 1863, the Football Association was founded amongst a small group of clubs from public school boys, of who we've been hearing about earlier, and Duncan's talk about cricket. But within 50 years, just before the start of the First World War, it's become a mass spectator sport. It's commercialised. And so on the cartoon on the left-hand side, you can see Mr. King Football with his little crown, and he's sat upon the hierarchy of competitive leagues, the Southern League, the Second Division and the First Division, and the huge piles of money that come in from gate receipts, from transfer fees, and this huge crowd of spectators that are looking up to him. And so by the eve of the First World War, people are amazed by how this sport has just grown from a small amateur pastime into a major commercialised sport. But there's a lot of concerns around that. Why, are players paid too much? Is £1,000 too much to pay for a professional footballer as a transfer fee? And so when the war comes along, it's seen as this potential moment to change it. And so by the end of the 1914-15 season, professional football, or rather the payment of players, is prohibited. So football can continue, and does continue through the First World War, which is something isn't well known. But players could not be paid between 1915 and 1918. And so on the right-hand side, you have this cartoon which illustrates the whole idea of that in terms of its being professional football, being wiped clean of its original sins. So there's another Mr. Football, washing the water of the new amateur conditions to make it all this new time, wartime sport. And so that's the kind of big idea sort of that's throughout the book of like how does a crisis change football?
Okay, great. So you've kind of touched upon this there, but maybe we could dig a little deeper with that. So what is one of the earliest kind of echoes of the First World War that you saw during the pandemic?
There we go. So one of the things that I found quite striking relatively early on is, apologies for bringing this particular former minister up onto the screen. This may be something you may not remember. That's right. Remember or have seen or come across, but relatively early on when we'd all closed down, football had stopped. Matt Hancock, during one of his lectures to the nation, decided to pick out professional footballers and professional football in terms for criticism. This is when clubs were using the furlough scheme to pay the lower paid members of staff money. And he suggested that footballers should take a pay cut, or should be taking larger pay cuts to help, contribute to this. Not anyone else in society, just footballers. And so this has an echo again in the First World War. Professional footballers got a lot of stick during the 14-15 season. Professionalism continues, but there's a war going on. Men are dying on the Western Front. And so for some people, this is seen as unacceptable, or that players should be doing more. They're seen as healthy young men. They should be in the forces. And what you see on the other side is a very popular recruiting poster by Punch magazine that was widely distributed. And Mr. Punch is talking to the professional footballer and saying, basically, you can earn money there's one field where you can earn money, but there's only one field where you can earn honour. And on the right-hand side, it's quite small, maybe not to see too well, is you've got this working class crowd, flat caps, cigarettes, and they are the young men that should be joining up, that the professional footballer is keeping from the front, as some people would have it. What these are both good examples of how professional footballers get picked out for very one-sided, essentially sort of negative propaganda, really. It's very much, one can argue with Hancock, it's about deflecting blame away from wider scrutiny of other things that are going on in terms of the government's response. In 1914-15, it was about picking out one segment of society who were felt by people in positions of power not to be doing their bit. As it was, professional footballers were volunteering for the forces, and also lots of young players were actually married men. At that time, they didn't encourage married men to join up until single men had joined up. So actually, professional footballers were like many other people in society. They had responsibilities to families, to children. If they joined up, they'd earn a lot less than if they were a professional footballer. So joining the army is not a simple decision. So there's a lot of sort of complexity around these debates that often in the public sphere and newspapers, especially when there was criticism from the right-wing press during the First World War, complex ideas get boiled down to very easy points to throw out to criticise people, and there's not a willingness to engage with those more complicated aspects of the topic.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the way that football, let's have the blanket of football, it involves many clubs and institutions, but let's just call it all football. What was the more positive side of its response to all of this?
So again, sort of what we saw especially during the first part of the lockdown, you'll probably seen football clubs trying to do more ways to engage with the community. So on the right-hand side, we have players from Stevenage FC, and their club organised distribution of food from the club as a food hub to vulnerable members of society who couldn't get out to get food, those issues where people may not have had too much food due to reductions in pay. And so at the museum we tried to collect a wide range of response to this. Everton used their community scheme to be a food hub, so did Manchester United, FC United. You also had the repurposing of stadiums as vaccine centres as well. And again, these have sort of echoes and similarities to the First World War. During the First World War, club grounds were taken over for men to do military drill. There were also, in some cases, repurposed. Tottenham Hotspur's ground was used to produce gas masks. It was actually taken over fully, so Tottenham then had to go and share with Arsenal for several seasons. QPR's ground was bought up by the Ministry of Munitions and turned into a gigantic factory, and then sent QPR on a little wandering road for several years till they found Loftus Road. So in London particularly, it had a big impact on where clubs could be based. We also had a wide range of active fundraising activities during the First World War. This cartoon relates to the Football League. They took a percentage of each gate of the match receipts from each game and distributed them to the clubs to then give back to the local communities. And they also distributed money themselves, so they gave them to local charities, to the Salvation Army, the YMCA, to the Footballers Battalion, which was a unit for football soldiers. So what you get within this, once you move beyond the sort of criticism of football, is that football is doing a lot of good within society. There's quite a wide range of that going on.
Yeah, thank you. And you've talked about clubs having to move around and so on, and disruption to what they're doing. You've indicated financial challenges really, for the country of course. What would you say the financial challenges were posed by this crisis to the Football League or the football sector, if you want to call it that? And how did clubs look to support each other through this time?
So one of the particularly interesting parallels that I've sort of found during COVID was if we go back, Castor might be back, what would it be, 2021, I think? And does anyone remember the European Super League? That very short-lived, but quite notorious scheme for reorganising football. Obviously saw, for those who may not be too familiar, I think it was about a dozen European clubs and about a half dozen, or the dirty half dozen from England, decided to propose a new European Super League where they would leave their own domestic leagues and create a Super League for themselves to keep the money for themselves, I think is the basic gist of it. Don't have to share it with everyone else. And so we did some collecting around the fan protests where fans gathered together, and that public reaction essentially sort of killed that idea dead. It was very interesting. Fan power is quite a difficult thing within football. This was a great example where it actually made a huge, crucial difference. It really shaped something that was going on and stopped it happening. So we collected some of the fan protest placards, and I found that really interesting because during the First World War, at the beginning of the war, clubs didn't share gate money with each other. Basically, you kept the money from your own gates. But then the challenges of having reduced crowds due to fans joining up to join the army, meant that clubs needed to share more money amongst each other for the rich to help the poor. So this idea was introduced for 1915-16, and it worked, but what it meant was the rich clubs ended up giving away money to the smaller ones. So in the summer of 1916, when they had their Football League's annual meeting to decide what to do, Everton led a protest movement of bigger clubs where they basically said, take this away or we're just going to go and play amongst ourselves. So it was a bit like basically holding a revolver to everyone and going like, do this or else. So obviously the smaller clubs were like, well, what do? We have to we'll have to just hope that we can get by on the old system of just you keep the money what you get from your own gates. Because there was a big imbalance between, say, Bury with like 1,500 people turning up and Liverpool or Everton getting 30,000 people. because even if you're not paying players, you've still got a lot of costs for running your club. So for the 1916-17 season, they went back to the old model and clubs were struggling. And as you can see from this cartoon, even the Liverpool Football Echo felt uncomfortable with this old way of doing things, of the rich keeping the money and the poor basically having to manage as best they could. So it shows the rich club trying to give a little hand to the poor club to avoid him falling into the murky waters of wartime football. And at the end of that season, they reintroduced gate sharing. And it was seen as a temporary solution, but actually it's a really important moment in the development of English football, because that gate sharing system lasted until the 1980s. It's removed when it's removed as the precursor to start redevelopment of English football and the promotion and creation of the Premier League. So whilst we often don't concentrate on the First World War, it has this really important moment of when the financial landscape of football changes in quite a subtle way, where there is support for smaller clubs from the bigger one, and the idea that this is a shared ecosystem. It can't be just one where the rich do well and the poor can just get on, really. Yeah.
All right then. How then does a crisis change our relationship with the past?
So one of the other things, again, at the beginning of lockdown, obviously, if we go back to then, we'll remember that obviously no live football. So sports channels, the BBC, have to try and find different ways of filling the time. And one of the ways they do that is by having their match of the day, where they had people like Ian Wright and Alan Shearer and Gary Lineker coming together to discuss past games. You had newspapers doing live minute-by-minute blogs of games from the past, like the 1978 World Cup. Football clubs broadcast games they had the rights to from in the past again. So my club, Newcastle United, did a full minute-by-minute screening, full broadcast of Newcastle United 8, Sheffield Wednesday 0, which definitely cheered me up one sort of dreary day. And so there's this whole sort of using the past to fill the gap in the present until live football could return to our screens. And again, that was quite something that echoed to me, because in the First World War, you have the rise of serialised autobiography amongst players. So here you can see Colin Vetch, Newcastle United's captain. They were the big team of the Edwardian period. And he's sitting down to write his memoirs, sort of like proof of authenticity. He might have had a ghostwriter assisting him, but actually Colin Vetch was actually a very well-educated footballer. He helped set up the People's Theatre in Newcastle. He was very interested in the theatre. His second wife was an actress. I have to not digress. He's a very fascinating character because he was very interested in politics, involved in the Players' Union, was at one point potentially mooted as a Labour MP candidate after the First World War. And so he contributes, and other players are contacted. Obviously, it's a bit of extra money from them during the war. And so the summer months would be filled with these stories, serialised stories by players about pre-war football. Again, it's escape from wartime, all the horribleness, the negative, or rather the depressing news you might be reading in the newspapers. And it's a chance to just get away from all our present travails into that glorious, wonderful past of disputed goals, offside goals, all that kind of stuff, championships, off-field banter, the stories behind this and that. And so that's where you start getting this emergence that continues into the interwar period of this interest in the game's history in the present. So, yeah, that was another sort of interesting sort of development.
Right, big question. Can a crisis offer a new vision of the game for the future?
So one of the aspects of the First World War I imagine that probably people are possibly most familiar with is women's football and its development and growth. So pre the First World War, you've had isolated attempts for women to play the game, often sometimes met with hostility in the 1880s, physical violence, beyond that, ridicule in both by people watching games and in the press. But with the growth of women in the workplace during the First World War, you get more women taking part in football in workplace environments. Again, as Duncan was saying, the important role of workplace sport, providing sport for people who haven't had it before or giving them access. So on the left-hand side, you see the Portsmouth Ladies FC, who are a wonderful team that I've done a bit of research on. They are composed of munition workers and women working in the post office in Portsmouth. And they became quite popular. They played a lot of games before tens of thousands of people. their pictures appeared in the press and also in the press in the States. And so what you have is this rapid growth in women's football, and it is a potential point where the game can be expanded and become for more people. The FA, a bit like the cricketing, again with Duncan's talk before, FA is run by a lot of older men, Victorian both in their education and outlook. So in the early 20s, in 1921, the FA banned FA clubs hosting women's games. So they don't ban women's football, they ban them from their space. So it's a big exclusion of like, you can go and do it, but you won't do it on our turf, literally, and our guys, our clubs can't support you. It's a big shuttering down of that space. So women do it, and they have to go and play on rugby league pitches, on like council pitches and stuff like that. So they keep continuing, but it's only until the 1960s when women are allowed officially across in England and across Europe to be able to play on FA-affiliated grounds. So historically, you've got that 50 years, 60 years of the women's game being held back and then developing again with more obstacles being placed in the way. And so arguably the impact of the pandemic, fortunately, is, well, what you see there is the discrepancies of that. There's still an imbalance, and obviously still now. So the letter on the right-hand side is from Barnsley Women FC. It was an open letter they produced and wrote in the immediate, when football restarted. So remember when, without crowds, football restarted, men's football, so you can see Premier League games. Women's football below a certain tier wasn't allowed to restart, but it wasn't the same. So it wasn't like all women's and men's football at these two tiers can restart. It's like that, more men's football and only this bit of women's football can restart. And essentially they called that out as sexism. It's a discrepancy. It's not a fair shake, so to speak. Fortunately, so the pandemic, it illustrates and shows those divides between men's and women's football, but fortunately hasn't stopped it. So the kind of my sort of closing point is that in terms of the post-pandemic world, where it's post-First World War world where women's football is stopped and the big shutter comes down, at least we're seeing women's football continues to be popular and develop. The pandemic hasn't been a huge blocker, hopefully. Participation rates are still rising. And that's partly because obviously we've had investment in women's football that's continued. We've also had a major tournament. England hosted the Women's Euros in 2005, but I think it's fair to say that Women's Euros in 2022 has been a major boost, especially in terms of the profile. Young girls can see a winning team, a team that has played on home soil that's won a major tournament. But there's also an engagement with the games past. So what you can see here, this is an event from November of last year, and that's the current England's women team with the England's women team that played in 1972. So that's the very first official England Women's International. England won 3-2 against Scotland, up in Scotland. So you can see the surviving players or their family relatives. And that's a great example of sort of how there is that engagement with the women's game now in terms of linking the past to the present, wanting to research more, find new role models, and bring the two together to then help shape that positive future for the women's game. And obviously I thought it was quite apt in terms of the festival's sort of three key ideas of rediscovering, reimagining and rebuilding. That's essentially what we're seeing here with women's football, which is really pleasing.
That's great. Right. I've got a few questions just to extend this and dig a little deeper into the theme, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. For a lot of people's, maybe the place they've been introduced to the idea of football in wartime might be, especially if you look online or in the media, usually comes around at Christmas. Mm-hmm. The football game in the trenches and the two main sides met in no man's land and had to kick around before they started, bombing each other again, shooting each other. What's the historical basis for that?
What you had was during the first winter of the First World War, the two armies are just beginning to get bogged down in trench warfare, but they're still sort of just building up their trenches and systems. And it's essentially it's the last bit of the professional armies, the volunteer conscripts and volunteers will be coming more into the field through 1915 and 16. So you have almost this kind of old school bit where it's professional soldiers to whom war is a job as opposed to a big emotional idea that motivated by patriotism, which recruits all the volunteers. So when it comes to the truce, they're able to sort of break the spell a little bit. They have a break. You have these small bits of fraternisation that then build up into larger bits where men come out from either side of the lines and talk to each other, share gifts. And so what is interesting, the Christmas match truce is a disputed one. Some historians don't believe anything took place like that. I think there is some evidence for very small informal kickabouts. It's not anything like you'll see in the adverts or in TV ones where it's formal, like there's whole goals or anything like that. Maybe even at best like the odd things down for goals. It was probably things like tin cans, maybe a football that one guy or two had. So there is some smaller documentary evidence for small bits and bobs of this, but it wasn't as anything as, I think the famous one is Captain Blackadder complaining about the offside decision that robbed him of a goal. I don't think it was as formal as that.
I wonder if years to come, historians will be disputing whether or not the bubbles were lifted during the COVID Christmases. What a lot of people might not realise is that FIFA, the global governing body for football, was itself only around 10 years old, I think, when the First World War broke out. And its World Cup didn't really exist yet. But competitions such as the Thomas Lipton Trophy existed, which were commercially sponsored tournaments between club teams from around the world. Those of people who are interested in the history of football and northern football might be aware that West Auckland won it in 1909 and 1911. So as a football historian, do you think West Auckland are the true inaugural World Cup winners? And what might have happened to the team if World War I hadn't broken out afterwards?
It's an interesting one, yeah. So you do have you begin to have the growth of sort of international football in that period before the war. The full England international team only went abroad once prior to the First World War. They went to Austria, and they played Austria and Hungary separately. But at that point, the England amateur international side was the one that toured the most. They went around Europe and went to Scandinavia particularly. So West Auckland are a sort of an interesting one because they're sort of more grassroots football. They famously beat Juventus, didn't they? I think, was that right?
I think it was Juventus. Yeah.
Yeah, it's when they were in their very early days. Yeah. That was the time when it was the AC Milan Football and Cricket Club. But the war is an interesting one because it sort of heralds a very sort of big sort of dividing bit in terms of the England amateur team participated as the GB Olympic football team in 1908 and 1912 and won the gold medal in the London Olympics in 1908 and the Stockholm Olympics in 1912. After the First World War, the European nations are caught up, particularly in Scandinavia, where there's not a war to disrupt things. So previously, Scandinavian countries looked to teams from England to come across and tour and play as their big sort of like meeting point. The war stops that and Scandinavian countries start playing each other more regularly and develops more of the rivalry between those countries. And so after the war, Scandinavian countries do well, and Norway, who previously would get battered by GB/England, beat England in the 1920 Olympics. But then also heralds the start of South American supremacy. The Uruguay side that wins the 1930 World Cup wins the two Olympic football tournaments in 24 and 28. And again, they are sort of starting to come through, so starting getting this more globalised world football culture at a point where England withdraws because they withdraw from FIFA after the First World War because they don't want to play former combatant nations and they're very strict. And they don't want other people, even if they didn't fight in the war, to also play. So the home nations withdraw from FIFA originally in the early 20s because they're like, we're not playing Germany, we're not playing Austria-Hungary, and we don't think anyone else should do. As do France, or rather France are opposed to this as well, and Belgium as well, because obviously they've been physically invaded. So it's only by the mid-20s that the home nations come back into FIFA and then leave very quickly again over amateurism issues because they don't want to, they object to how you define payments in football and what is an amateur and what is a professional in the Olympics.
It's great. Now, the Football Museum, National Football Museum in Manchester, where you curate and do a great job, I might say. It's a really interesting place to visit if you're interested in football, and you will find things like you will see examples of things like how football, the design of football has evolved, and shirts, medical treatment, the league's evolved, the growth of like the women's game and things as well. With things like the war, how do you incorporate the more difficult topics like war and some of the other things which you touch upon in the museum? How do you incorporate that and make sure that you keep it sort of inclusive? And there might be tourists from around the world come to the museum and they might have different views on or experiences of war. This kind of thing. I mean, what do you consider, and what exhibitions have you done? What do you consider, and how do you make sure that that's informative, inclusive, and what we like to think of sort of professionally done?
Yeah, it's obviously doing any exhibition around conflict is very, very challenging. When we did the First World War exhibition in 2014, I think we made the main focus on people's stories. That was our main way into it. We started off our first main story, introduced in the exhibition, as a story of Wilfred Bartrop. So he was an FA Cup winner with Barnsley in 1912. So there's a good Yorkshire connection. And he joined Liverpool, and sadly he was killed about 3 or 4 or 5 days just before the end of the war. So that was one way to sort of personalise it. Like, it's a big topic, how do you talk about the First World War? We tried to make it, bring that particular football element into it. But we also tried to look at try not to make it all about death, so to speak. So we tried to look at those home front stories, women's football. And we also looked at the post-war stories, and that's one of the things I found quite interesting again in the book as well, that sort of what was the impact of the war on players who lived through it and survived. One of my favourite sort of objects in the collection is we have an England cap that was awarded to Sam Wadsworth, and it was his last one. He was captain of England against Scotland in front of about 120,000 people. And that's quite remarkable because when he came, he lied about his age to join up as a 17-year-old. And at the time he was playing for Blackburn Rovers in their youth team, and they were then the champions of England. So that would be like a Man United youth team player, might be like an under-21 international, lying about his age to join up now. And he came back, and after the war, Blackburn went, really sorry, but we haven't got a space for you. We've got a lot of players in the books, and thanks very much. You've done 4 years in the trenches. Over to you, really. So we went home, and what's amazing is he sat down later in life and recorded his autobiography. So you can hear him actually, sorry, always gets me each time because you can actually hear him sort of like talking about being ready to throw his boots in the fire because he just wanted to give up completely. But he didn't. His dad came in and convinced him to give it another go. And so he then went on and got spotted, played for Huddersfield Town, won 3 league titles back to back, won an FA Cup. So I think those are some of the ways where you can try and pick out those human stories, and then that can be hopefully a bridge in for people to then go and explore it more, really.
Thank you. It's really good. I mean, I enjoy a war museum and a war film as much as a lot of people do. But, it's when you're going to a football museum, it might attract people who have a different expectation of what they're going there for. So having to be a little sensitive to these things is important, which leads me to my next question, which is, in terms of, public relations, if you like, and how well do you think football, like in terms of the FA, the leagues, Premier League, the footballing institutions and the clubs, how well do you think they reacted to World War I, and how well do you think they've handled COVID?
It's quite interesting. I should add that we've got an FA member of the FA on our trustee board, so I probably should be careful a little bit.
We can focus on the positives.
I'm trying to think. Trying to think in the First World War context first. I suppose in the context of COVID, it's obviously, as you say, PR. It's as much as about telling people what you're doing and getting that positive message across when people are going to be quite keen to slag you off. It's interesting. One of the interesting things there you saw with the COVID pandemic was the England women's football team got to go to, I think it was Qatar at one point when we were still all in bubbles. And so it was an interesting example of the positives, the women England football team having money invested in them, getting time to go out and be a team together. The problem was that they posted quite a number of photographs themselves, having a nice time, being able to do stuff that necessarily people at home weren't able to do because of the different restrictions. So there was an issue there, obviously, like the optics, to use the fancy word, isn't it? And obviously, but then some people pointed out, it's like, is this actual progress? Women footballers have got a level of fame and are being treated like male footballers, i.e. they're getting flack for it. So it's actually, is this progress in a backhanded kind of way, so to speak? So that's an interesting example of sort of like things that you can see as progress can also be seen as negatives. And I think that is a bigger challenge also within women's football, is how do you take the best of men's football that you're perhaps aiming for, but then also how do you keep what's unique to women's football, and then also how do you avoid some of the pitfalls of the male professional football world in terms of the commercialisation, shall we say. So yeah, and obviously saw with the Barnsley women one, that's one where again where the FA is trying to find a way through in terms of how to support different tiers of the game. What may seem like a sensible decision at some was obviously to other people interpreted as sexism or discrimination. So yeah, it's been a very challenging time, I think.
All right, thank you very much. And I'd like now to let other people ask some questions, because I've talked for long enough, certainly. We've got a question over there. Now, we'll need some microphones, so if you could wait for the mic to come over. Please, thank you.
Thanks. That was absolutely fascinating. I know a bit about football during the Second World War, and I know from a competitive basis the Football League stopped, but there was regional football, and certain clubs like Aldershot and Portsmouth were very good because they had guest players who were serving in the forces. Could you say something about competition in the First World War, which I don't know much about?
Yeah.
Apart from, I am a Tottenham supporter, so I know about the shenanigans after the First World War about promotion to the First Division. So could you also talk about clubs that benefited or didn't benefit from the First World War?
Yes, it's you have very basically similar outlines. So what you have is regional leagues to cut down the travelling. So in the First World War, it's Lancashire, the Midlands, and London. And what you get is it's almost like grassroots football. It's about you're after a pool of players, and players have got jobs. So it's about, have you got time to play? It's also about who you know. So some footballers go home to where they're originally from. So you might be playing for Tottenham, but you might live in Leicester, and you might go back to Leicester. And so then Leicester City will go like, oh, can you come and play for us? And you're like, well, yeah, it's better. I don't want to travel down to London. So then it becomes about who do you know, contacts and things like that. But what it also becomes down to is technically, players are amateurs, you don't get money, but actually there are under-the-counter payments going on, boot money, as it was called, where you leave a couple of shillings or whatever in someone's boot to collect after the game. And so Leeds City get a lot of the top players from the northeast, from clubs like Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, and they're all travelling down from the northeast where their clubs have shut down, and they're travelling down to Leeds. And they have a really, really good team, and they win several of the Midland leagues. And then after the war, it turns out they were paying them £2 a week, which probably accounts for why they were willing to travel so far to come and play. And actually Leeds City, as it was at the time, get basically thrown out of the Football League, because the Football League hear of this. It comes out through a disgruntled player who doesn't get a contract post First World War. So they have to ask to see the books. Leeds go, oh, what books? Where? Well, no, maybe not. And then the Football League give them a deadline, the books aren't produced, and they are kicked out of the Football League mid-season. And the players are sold at public auction along with all of the rest of the club gear, so all the goalposts, all the extra stuff. And so the players are sold. So all the managers turn up and it's like, we have Alex Gillett, wing back or left back, who will start me off at 50 quid. And one of the players who only went for £100 went to Aston Villa and then won the FA Cup at the end of that season. So he did quite well from like not having a club literally to being an FA Cup winner. But another team that do quite well are Stoke. So they have a lot of players who are in reserved occupations, so like coal mining and stuff like that. And they do quite well. And in one game, they beat Blackburn Rovers, who are, like I say, pre-First World War league champions, very big club. Stoke had gone bankrupt, so they're on the rise. And Stoke beat them 16-0. Which is a goal. I've forgotten it. It's like a goal every 6 or 7, 8 minutes or something like that. They were 8-0 up at half time, and they've got another 8 in the second half. And some people don't take this too well, and Liverpool are in a title race. And so there's cartoons in Liverpool press complaining, oh, it's not fair sportsmanship to beat, because it's like top good players at Stoke versus this really weak Blackburn team of like teenagers and players who are past it. And then also it does get quite nasty, because one of the Blackburn officials, who's anonymous, says, oh, at least our players are where they should be, i.e. in the forces. And so this discussion that, well, actually those guys got conscripted, they're not volunteers per se. But it's interesting because a Blackburn Rovers player had been killed at the front about 3 weeks before, about a month or so. So obviously there's that kind of rawness, there's tension, but it does come to the big ideas of like what is appropriate in wartime, and what is right by someone is different by someone else. So yeah, so I hope that answers that a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Alex, that was fascinating. Really, really enjoyed that. I've got a couple of questions, and I suppose I'm going to do the thing, unfortunately, of taking you out a little bit out of your time frame as well. So apologies for that. I mean, the first thing, when you talked about the First World War, and I'm just thinking outside of that, you had the kind of Spanish flu that came in, and of course that's a direct comparison, of course, with the pandemic. I just wonder if there's any kind of similarities there in terms of what happened with the national game around that, and kind of whether there's anything in kind of papers, newspapers around that. And the second point is around kind of, my own club, kind of non-league club, was founded in kind of 1919, and you see a lot of kind of clubs around that kind of immediate kind of post-war period. I think Leeds being most notable. They were formed in that year, and I don't think there's probably something that's happening on the back of the First World War, kind of soldiers coming back, probably kind of keeping people occupied, welfare, kind of that camaraderie. You've seen lots of clubs being established. I wonder if you've seen anything kind of in the archives around that, and kind of formation of clubs and that kind of peak in the immediate First World War period, and what's going on from the kind of the experiences into kind of communities and to industry as well, kind of the formation of clubs.
So on the first one, on the Spanish flu, that was quite interesting, because I'd finished writing that probably just about 3 or 4 months before the pandemic came along. And I was like, oh, this research seems quite relevant. And the basic one with that was because Spanish flu came during the war. So basically it was seen as secondary, because you've had 4 years of industrialised killing. And so it, as one historian said, it lacked a certain gravitas, because you've had a war with all the concepts around sacrifice going on and the scale of it. And obviously pre-war society has a lot of deaths within it through industrial accidents. So when the flu comes along, and that's literally what they call it the flu, and it's Spanish just because that's where it was first sort of reported, not where it probably started. It's just sort of in the backdrop. It's obviously affecting society, but its main concern is like, will it affect the war effort? So they look to not to try and use too many measures that will stop people working. It's a very fractured response across the country. So basically local health authorities or local health officers have the role of deciding how you respond to it in different area. And so they didn't really it took them a while to appreciate that people gathering indoors was one way of it spreading. And only after a while did they try to discourage like theatre performances and try to limit some people coming in. So football scene is like perfectly fine. There's no attempts to stop people coming together for it or go to it, even though obviously you're encouraging people to get on public transport to get there. And its main effect, it gets referred to as sort of like it's referred to as like the flu is almost like a joke at different times. But you see reports of players getting ill, and sadly there are some cases of sort of fairly sort of senior players. Like the thing that was really shocking about it was you probably died in under about a week to 8 days, in terms of you getting it, becoming quite seriously ill, and then dying. So basically you have players being selected for like a game 1 week. Like one weekend being ready for it, and then they're dead the next one. So it kills a small number of players and grassroots players, but yeah, it's sort of almost like a backdrop to it all. And then on the second one, yes, you sort of get there's a continuation of like football, grassroots football is becoming popular pre-First World War, and it continues after the war. In terms of the camaraderie, what's interesting is you see quite a number of teams where they're called comrades teams. So you have the growth of things like the British Legion and sort of societies and groups for soldiers who have been demobilised. And so you get teams where guys are in the forces together. It's like, oh, good, we know each other, we like playing football, or we come together, we've got that shared background experience. So in some photographs in the newspapers, you can see teams are winning divisions, and it'll be like Comrades FC. And obviously, they sort of drop off. They have a time limit. They drop off after about 10 years or so because they're a group of players with a particular shared experience. So it's not like a workplace one where you get fresh blood coming in, so to speak. There are odd exceptions. So there is actually one team. I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but there's one team in Northern Ireland where they were founded as a one like that, and they still going today. So they've managed to keep that all going. So they still have the stuff on the boards and the walls, I believe. So yeah. Oh, cheers.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, there's one. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was amazing. I just wanted to ask a little bit about sort of that conflict, I guess, that you spoke about in terms of the European Super League between sort of fans and clubs, and the sort of the powers that be within clubs. And you also kind of referenced how football clubs during the pandemic were kind of used for different purposes, like vaccinations and sort of helping out and serving the public good. So I was just wondering sort of how, coming out of this recent crisis of the pandemic and the First World War, the sort of how fans have been able to sort of keep a hold of their clubs, and how clubs have been able to remain focused on the public good and be sort of involved in their community instead of maybe being focused more on the sort of a money-making objective or a profit objective.
So after the First World, what was interesting during the First World War is you get some writers talking about, well, actually we give, always have a percentage of gate receipts being given away as for charitable purposes. This is a rich game, there's plenty of money of it, we can afford to give away X amount. And it's an interesting idea that goes around after the First World War, and as you can probably imagine, nothing happens with it. It's very much like a rush to sort of re-establish what was there before, and so that opportunity for change is sort of like missed or lost, shall we say. I think obviously in the context of the pandemic is that by then football clubs had, through their schemes for football in the community that were set up primarily sort of the 80s and the 90s, they are a good PR role, a good exercise. And obviously I don't want to talk them down. They did some really, really amazing, important work during the pandemic. It's very interesting, obviously, that's how clubs could use those schemes to present that positive side of what they were doing, to try and counter, obviously, those wider discussions about players' wages that were going elsewhere in the media. I think with these things, it's the scale of the redistribution. It's like how much money, because the money coming in from TV rights is huge and continues to be huge. It's like, what could you do if you took more than just a couple of percent, and maybe like had 5 or 10%, and that is redistributed more broadly across, more schemes involving football across society. You give it more to more grassroots clubs or to the lower leagues to stop that widening. I think, as Dunk was saying, that growth, the difference between the haves and the have-nots within football is stratospheric, isn't it? And that's because we have nation states now funding clubs, including my own Newcastle United. That has huge sort of ramifications, so to speak. Although, probably to counter that and to play devil's advocate, you only have to go to Manchester and probably in Newcastle in 10 years to see the scale of the investment that those states will have put into those clubs and the wider areas around them. It is quite a complex, quite a complex picture that lends itself to some very easy generalisations and perhaps prejudices. And then when we get into perhaps the nitty-gritty of some of it, it becomes a little bit more grey and murkier, because up in the northeast, the local MPs are quite positive, I think, about that investment. And that's probably in the context of Brexit, the last 20, 30 years, deindustrialisation, where has the money to come and radically change the northeastern economy come, and arguably there's a reason why Brexit was very strong in terms of voters up in the northeast particularly. That's to sort of get off even to bigger, wider sort of social issues and topics there.
Yeah, sorry. Just really a follow on what you just saying. I must admit, personally, I don't know a great deal about the Newcastle United, but about the investment you're saying with the Saudis and everything, and all the benefits that maybe some people don't see that are happening on a local level in Newcastle and benefiting, the community. But what are the motives behind that? What do they get out of it? Why does a foreign country come to Newcastle, and what is their motivation? What is it, do you think, that they're trying to achieve? Really, what's behind it, really, to all those millions of pounds that they're willing to spend? And and not spend it in their own country, but they come to, say, Newcastle, just as an example.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's the thing is like who benefits from this. Yeah, it's the thing is with this one, it's not just sport. It's why does any major investor from who's non-domestic from an outside country come and invest anything, whether it be energy, transport, land, particularly investments in housing and building. It's like, well, how do they benefit? Is it a straight financial benefit, or is it a wider cultural soft power? And that's the thing. Yeah, I think it's sort of, you get into obviously the terms of like sports washing, potentially obviously given different around elements of like human rights records. I should probably say at this point, everything I'm saying is my own personal opinion and not that of my employer, just to put that.
There is
careful, always have to be careful around that.
To couch it in an academic, because we can always, there was, I saw a research presentation in the last few years which suggested as some of those economies are moving from oil, they're looking for tourism, leisure, as well as the PR, the soft power, changing opinions, winning favour and that kind of thing.
Diversifying
out of oil and or gas into other things.
To put it in the longer historical context, this one is like sport has always been used in different ways by regimes and all sorts of different ways to either bolster itself domestically or internationally. Obviously, having a successful international team in any sport has been used by democracies and, communist governments, fascist governments, pick your ruling creed as if you will. So these things are not unique. And I think sometimes in the Western world it's recognising sometimes that our political outlook may not be the same political outlook as someone else's, I think. Yeah.
Question over here, if we could have a microphone there, please. Oh, we've got two over there, so we'll do one then the other, please.
Not a question, just on the sports washing. Yesterday, the Financial Times has a fantastic article on Saudi Arabia, specifically dealing with golf, but also touching on what Saudi Arabia is up to, trying to put money into sports and kind of go away from the bad stuff they've been doing.
Yeah. And the golf is one, just to mention that, it's a very interesting one because it overlaps into football again, because the leading figure within the golf is also chairman of Newcastle United, if I've got my facts right on that one. So there was an article in the Daily Telegraph about that a few days ago, looking at that crossover. So again, it's this blending of different sports into this broader approach in terms of investment and use of sport for wider cultural purposes.
Next question, please.
Hiya, just a quick one. I just sort of going off on a tangent a bit, but I just wondered what your personal opinion on VAR is, because we've managed for a couple of 100 years or whatever without it, and I just wondered if you personally, just a quick one, do you think it's enhanced the game or has it made it worse, in your opinion, please? Thank you for such a brilliant talk.
No, at all. And I do like a good VAR discussion. What's interesting is actually I came across a cartoon from the 1900s which envisaged football 100 years ago, and what they had was like linesmen being held aloft by balloons over the pitch to get a better view of it. So I think they were sort of moving towards VAR, and they were using photographs. There's a great one when Barnsley won the cup in when Barnsley were in the FA Cup final in 1910, when they lost to Newcastle United, they were winning 1-0 with 10 minutes to go. And Newcastle United equalised with a controversial equalising goal, which some of the newspapers the next day claimed they had conclusive photographic evidence to prove the goal was offside. Which, obviously it proves nothing, it just shows where the ball was at that exact moment where the photograph was taken, not where the ball was when it was kicked. So there's always been this quest for can technology prove things and use it. I think the thing with VAR is that it's the catch-up of VAR now allows the laws of the game to be implemented in their purest and strictest format, which is not necessarily the best thing for a competitive, exciting game of football watched by a large audience.
For example, in 1966 was exactly the wrong time to bring in something.
And so I think what they're doing is it's the catch-up to how the laws of the game relate to technology, and then also what kind of output you want. Because obviously how you apply the laws of the game, once upon a time there was the idea of the laws of the game apply to whatever level of whatever level you play. So you have some minor differences, i.e. you have linesmen, you don't at the very lowest levels of grassroots. Once you reach a certain level, you have to have linesmen. But that was about as complicated as it got. Whereas now it's much more complex. We have a hierarchy between Premier League clubs that have all of that down to lower league clubs that won't have VAR. There was a discussion around the Women's FA Cup final because they were using VAR there, but they don't use VAR in Women's League games. So then, is that fair or right? Is it impacting the game there in terms of expecting players to have to learn how to play with VAR? Because actually, once you're playing with VAR, it does change how players, how they perform. Especially, obviously, if you're a centre half who might like to get physical, shall we say. Once you have VAR there, you can do a lot less of the this kind of stuff at corners. And
in the very early days of association football, the version of the game we're talking about today, the clubs are nominated like umpires, and they'd have a representative umpire. And eventually it morphed into referees who wore tweed jackets and things. But there might be a referee, but the referee would sit in the pub during the game. And only if there was a dispute, the nominated umpires couldn't decide on, they would go and find him, explain what had happened, and he'd give a decision. So, even without VAR, it's still way ahead of those days.
I think they just need to, what do you want VAR to do? How do we keep football as a spectacle good, moving quite quickly? And what level of incorrect decision are you willing to put up with? Because there's almost like this quest for... And the referees' official groups themselves have talked about the increase of correct decisions. And it's that's great, but I'm not sure that's necessarily having a positive impact on the game. So it's what percentage of incorrect decisions are you willing to live with? Because the wider product is better because it's people enjoying it. Because I think the feedback from quite a lot of people is especially in stadiums, it's why am I waiting around 3 or 4 minutes? And then also, because I was at a game, it's what's the decision for? It's you have people getting mobiles out and going my mate says he's watched the replay and this is what it's for. And in the stadium, you have no idea. And sometimes they don't even tell you why it was ruled out, which is again quite poor because you have this big stop on it. So yeah, it's quite an interesting one.
Now I'm just going to check the time. Thank you for the question. I think we've got to call an end to the questions there. Although I'm sure other people have got ideas coming along now. So I will just do some closing remarks, and then if anyone has questions they want to ask Alex, maybe they could do that outside of the room, maybe while buying his book. So let's have the vote of thanks for Alex then. So thank you, Alex Jackson, for the fascinating session, for answering so many great questions from the audience, mainly those ones, I think. And I'm sure many of you here today will be keen to get hold of a copy of his book, which we've now made famous, available to buy from the independent bookseller Fox Lane Books, which I think have got a stall downstairs. Alex, if he's willing to, will be there signing books for anyone. He's far too modest to suggest that himself, so I'm going to suggest he might do it. And thank you, everyone, for coming, making the event, asking the questions, providing the interest in it, and enjoy anything else you might attend at the festival programme. So thank you lot, and thank you, Alex.